I watched my dying wife's dream home get demolished, while the HOA president smiled and checked items off her clipboard like she was grocery shopping. The roar of diesel engines drowned out everything except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Sawdust mixed with morning lake mist, creating this sick, sweet smell that made my stomach turn. The crunch of splintering wood echoed across the water as my $2.3 million lakefront mansion, the place Sarah and I planned to grow old together, got turned into rubble over $847 in bogus fees. Deborah Whitmore stood there in her pressed blazer, practically glowing with satisfaction. She thought she'd finally crushed the troublemaker who dared question her authority. What she didn't know was that she was standing on my land. All of it. Every acre in this valley, and she just made the worst mistake of her life. What would you do if your HOA demolished your dream home while you stood there helpless? Or so they thought. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this revenge is about to get legendary. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and 3 years ago I thought I had life figured out. I just sold my software company for $40 million at age 48, and my wife Sarah and I were finally going to build our dream retirement home. We'd found this perfect spot in Willowbrook Valley, Colorado, 847 acres of pristine mountain wilderness wrapped around a crystal-clear lake, about 2.5 hours from Denver. Sarah had stage 4 pancreatic cancer when we bought the land. The doctors gave her 6 months, but she was determined to see our house built. She'd sit in her wheelchair on the construction site, directing workers with this fierce joy that made everyone fall in love with her. The smell of fresh pine lumber became her favorite scent because it meant we were building our future together. The sound of hammers ringing against nails was music to her ears. She passed away 3 months before the house was finished. I moved into our lakefront mansion alone, carrying her ashes in a wooden box she'd picked out herself. Our 2 adult kids, Connor, 28, an architect in Denver, and Riley, 25, an environmental lawyer, helped me through those first brutal months. The place was everything we'd dreamed, 6,200 square feet of timber and glass, with a wraparound deck that caught the sunrise over the mountains. Morning frost would crunch under my feet when I walked the wooden dock at dawn, the metallic taste of grief still sharp in my mouth. The community seemed perfect. 34 luxury homes, average value around $1.8 million, filled with successful professionals who'd escaped city stress. Old money families mixed uneasily with new tech wealth. Think country club meets Silicon Valley, with all the charm you'd expect from that combination. Then I met Deborah Whitmore, and my peaceful grief sanctuary turned into a war zone. She appeared at my door 2 weeks after I moved in, clipboard clutched like a weapon, wearing a smile that could freeze hell over. 58 years old, former corporate HR director, who'd clearly missed her calling as a prison warden. Divorced with no kids, just her and that massive house she'd inherited from her ex-husband's family money. She'd been HOA president for 7 years, ruling the valley like her personal fiefdom. Your dock extends 12 inches beyond approved specifications, she announced like she was delivering a terminal diagnosis. That's a $150 violation. I blinked. This dock was pre-approved by the previous board. I have all the documentation. Her smile turned predatory. Previous approvals don't supersede current standards. I'm the president now, and I enforce current compliance. When I politely requested clarification in writing, like a reasonable human being, that $150 fine magically became $847. She called it an attitude adjustment fee for hostile correspondence. Apparently, asking for basic documentation qualified as acts of war in Deborah's twisted kingdom. I started digging and discovered the ugly truth. Tom Chen whispered how she'd terrorized his elderly parents into selling by claiming their medical oxygen equipment violated aesthetic guidelines. Maria Santos showed me photos of blatant violations on properties owned by Deborah's inner circle, violations that mysteriously never resulted in fines. Florence Pike, an 82-year-old widow, tearfully described how Deborah had forced her to remove her late husband's memorial garden for being non-conforming landscaping. The pattern was crystal clear. Deborah targeted newcomers and anyone who questioned her authority, while her cronies violated rules with complete impunity. She'd perfected the art of selective enforcement, driving out undesirable residents through financial warfare and psychological terrorism. What I didn't know yet was that several families had already been forced to sell at massive losses, fleeing Deborah's reign of terror. The Hendersons had lost nearly $300,000 selling under duress after she'd manufactured a series of escalating violations. I was about to become her next victim, or so she thought. 2 days after my polite request for documentation, I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was my bank. Mr. Blackwood, we need to discuss a complication with your mortgage. There's been a lien placed on your property for unpaid HOA fees. I nearly dropped the phone. That's impossible. I never received proper notice of any meeting. The metallic taste of panic filled my mouth as the banker explained the details. Deborah had called an emergency HOA meeting with exactly 48 hours' notice, perfectly timed for when she knew I'd be visiting Riley in Denver. She'd pushed through a vote to place a lien on my property with only her inner circle present. Tom, Maria, and Florence had no idea it was even happening. But here's where Deborah really showed her true colors, the mini twist that revealed just how vindictive she could be. While I was dealing with the shock of the lien, she'd also published the monthly community newsletter featuring a full-page article titled "Maintaining Community Standards: A Shared Responsibility." The piece never mentioned names, but it might as well have included my photo. It described a homeowner who'd constructed unauthorized modifications and responded with inappropriate hostility to reasonable enforcement measures. Every detail pointed straight at me, down to describing someone who clearly doesn't understand the importance of community harmony. Subtle as a sledgehammer to the face, our Deborah. I'd learned a thing or two about legal warfare during my software company days, and I knew Riley's environmental law background had taught her about bureaucratic combat. My first call went to Patricia Gomez, the county's best real estate attorney. She cut straight to the chase. "Marcus, I've seen this before. Colorado requires 30-day written notice before any lien proceedings, plus proper meeting protocols. If they violated either requirement, and it sounds like they violated both, we can get this thing thrown out faster than last week's fish." That conversation reminded me of something I'd read years ago during a property dispute with a previous business partner. HOA liens aren't automatic. They have strict procedural requirements, and violations can void the entire process. It was like discovering your opponent had been playing poker with marked cards. Within 48 hours, I'd filed for a complete financial audit of HOA records and installed a state-of-the-art security system around my property. Call it paranoia, but those unmarked cars doing slow drive-bys at odd hours suggested Deborah's routine inspections were about to become a lot less routine. The sound of gravel crunching under expensive wheels became my early warning system. Tom Chen was the first neighbor to reach out privately. He slipped a note under my door that simply read, "She did this to the Hendersons too. Coffee tomorrow, 7 a.m., Lakeside Diner." Over bitter coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, Tom told me the real story. His elderly parents had lived peacefully in the Valley for 15 years until his father needed an oxygen concentrator after a heart attack. Deborah declared the medical equipment an aesthetic violation because it was visible from the street through a window. "The fine started at $50 a day," Tom said, his hands shaking as he stirred sugar into his cup. By month 3, they owed more than their Social Security income. They had to sell for $200,000 under market value just to escape. Maria Santos joined our quiet resistance next, showing me photos that made my jaw drop. Deborah's best friend had an obviously unlicensed room addition. The HOA treasurer's fence exceeded height limits by 3 feet. The secretary's landscaping completely blocked a fire hydrant, a legitimate safety violation if there ever was one. None of them had received so much as a warning letter. But the story that really lit my fuse came from Florence Pike. That sweet 82-year-old widow came to my door in tears, explaining how Deborah had forced her to remove her late husband's memorial rose garden. "I planted those roses on our 50th anniversary," Florence whispered, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Harold spent his last summer tending them. She said they weren't architecturally consistent with neighborhood aesthetics." The smell of those destroyed roses still lingered in Florence's yard. A sickly sweet scent of petals left to rot in the compost bin. That's when the full picture became crystal clear. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was systematic targeting of anyone who didn't fit Deborah's narrow vision of who belonged in her valley. New money, elderly residents, anyone who dared question her authority. We were all marked for elimination. The stakes couldn't be higher. My home, my peace, and my ability to honor Sarah's memory were all under direct attack. But Deborah had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd picked a fight with someone who had both the resources and the motivation to fight back, and I was just getting started. 3 weeks into my legal challenge, Deborah decided to escalate from petty harassment to full-scale psychological warfare. It started with the anonymous complaints. 7 different violation notices arrived in my mailbox over 5 days, each one more ridiculous than the last. My landscaping was excessive and non-conforming. My security cameras created privacy concerns for neighbors. The outdoor furniture on my deck violated aesthetic guidelines. Even my mailbox, the same standard black box every house had, was suddenly not in compliance with community standards. The smell of fresh ink on those violation notices became as familiar as my morning coffee, and about as welcome as a tax audit. But here's the mini twist that showed just how deep Deborah's corruption ran. She wasn't just making up rules as she went, she was retroactively changing them. I discovered this when Patricia pulled the official HOA bylaws from county records and compared them to the updated standards Deborah was citing. The sound of Patricia's pen-scratching notes filled her office as she cross-referenced documents. Marcus, what she's doing isn't just unethical, it's textbook fraud. She's been quietly amending community rules without board votes, proper notice, or legal authority. Turns out our HOA president had basically appointed herself dictator and started rewriting laws to target specific people. I remembered reading about similar cases during my business days. Officials who thought they could change rules without following procedures always ended up in handcuffs eventually. My counterpunch came courtesy of Riley, whose environmental law background had taught her about bureaucratic investigation techniques. She'd spent her weekend digging through Colorado state databases and discovered something that made my blood boil. Deborah's ex-husband had been a county commissioner for 12 years. Dad, she's still using his old connections, Riley explained over a crackling phone connection. I found 3 county inspectors who work directly under him. Want to bet they're still doing favors for the ex-wife? That explained the surprise county safety inspection scheduled for the following Tuesday. Inspector Randy Fletcher showed up looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal, carrying a clipboard thicker than a Stephen King novel. He spent 3 hours measuring everything from my stair risers to my deck railing heights, clearly fishing for violations. The metallic snap of his tape measure became the soundtrack to my growing certainty that this inspection had been choreographed in advance. But Randy didn't know about my secret weapon, comprehensive documentation. Every conversation, every measurement, every theatrical discovery he made was being recorded by my security system. I'd learned during my software development years that when dealing with corrupt officials, video evidence beats their word every single time. Riley had also armed me with some interesting legal ammunition from her corruption cases. Colorado's Fair Debt Collection Practices Act covers HOAs too. Organizations that threaten liens without proper documentation face $1,000 penalties per violation, plus attorney fees. It was like discovering your poker opponent had been playing with marked cards for years. When Randy discovered that my deck railing was allegedly 1 inch too low, a measurement that somehow contradicted the original building inspector's approval, I knew we'd caught them manufacturing evidence. The community intelligence network was growing stronger too. Tom Chen's weekend barbecues became our unofficial war room, where the smell of grilled burgers mixed with the taste of sweet revenge. Maria Santos had started photographing every violation Deborah ignored throughout the neighborhood, building a database that would make a federal prosecutor's mouth water. Even Florence Pike had joined our resistance, keeping a detailed log of Deborah's inspection visits with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She forced the Yamadas out 2 years ago, Maria revealed, flipping through her evidence folder. Claimed their Japanese garden violated native landscaping requirements that didn't exist until she invented them on the spot. Tom's knuckles went white around his beer bottle. The Parkers lost everything over their daughter's wheelchair ramp. Deborah called it an unapproved modification that affected property values. The pattern was crystal clear: systematic elimination of anyone who didn't fit Deborah's narrow vision of who belonged in her valley. Discrimination disguised as property management, successful because victims either couldn't afford legal battles or didn't understand their rights. The evening mountain air carried the sound of distant laughter from other neighborhood gatherings, a reminder of the peaceful community this could be without Deborah's tyranny. But she'd made one fatal miscalculation this time. She'd picked a fight with someone who had deep pockets, legal connections, and a daughter who specialized in dismantling corrupt officials piece by piece. Deborah thought she was tightening the noose around my neck. Instead, she was weaving the rope that would hang her entire criminal enterprise. By month 2 of our war, Deborah had apparently decided that subtlety was overrated. She was done playing games and ready to go nuclear. The acceleration started with an emergency assessment notice that appeared in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Every homeowner was being charged $2,800 for immediate structural repairs to community infrastructure. The notice gave residents exactly 10 days to pay, with late fees starting at $150 per day. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, premium card stock that probably cost more than most people's grocery bills. Deborah wasn't just stealing our money, she was doing it with style, But here's where the mini twist revealed just how desperate she'd become. This wasn't a real emergency assessment. Riley's investigation into the HOA's financial records, which we'd finally obtained through Patricia's legal maneuvering, showed something that made my jaw drop. Every single community improvement expense from the past 18 months matched renovations to Deborah's own property. The $15,000 for entrance gate maintenance coincided with her new wrought iron fence. The $8,500 for landscape consulting happened the same month she installed a professional irrigation system. The $12,000 for legal fees was paid to a law firm that didn't exist. The address led to a UPS store mailbox. "Dad," Riley said during our emergency video call, her voice tight with controlled anger, "she's been embezzling HOA funds to upgrade her own house for almost 2 years. This isn't property management, it's organized theft." My counterpunch came in the form of a whistleblower complaint to the IRS and a formal fraud report to the state attorney general's office. But I also had Connor, my architect's son, help me with something more immediately satisfying: a photographic surveillance operation. Connor spent his weekend hiking around the Valle with a telephoto lens, documenting every upgrade to Deborah's property. Her new kitchen, visible through massive windows she'd apparently forgotten, provided zero privacy, featured granite countertops that matched the community kitchen renovation expense from 6 months ago. The custom deck overlooking the lake matched both the materials and timeline of another mysterious HOA expenditure. The sound of Connor's camera shutter clicking became the rhythm of our revenge symphony. I'd learned something valuable during a previous business dispute involving municipal contracts. When dealing with embezzlement, the IRS doesn't just investigate, they audit with the enthusiasm of bloodhounds following a fresh scent. Filing that whistleblower report was like releasing a pack of very well-educated wolves. Meanwhile, Deborah was spreading rumors about my mental health with the dedication of a gossip columnist. She'd started telling neighbors that grief over Sarah's death had made me unstable and potentially dangerous. According to her whisper campaign, my legal challenges were really just the desperate actions of someone who couldn't accept authority. The bitter taste of coffee during my morning calls with Patricia became associated with updates on Deborah's character assassination attempts. But our growing alliance of fed-up neighbors was becoming impossible to ignore. Tom, Maria, and Florence had recruited 8 other families who'd been pressured into silence by Deborah's previous campaigns. Each family brought documentation of selective enforcement, manufactured violations, and financial abuse. Mrs. Chen showed us photos of the oxygen equipment violation that had forced Tom's parents to sell. The Santoses had recorded phone calls where Deborah admitted to making examples of troublemakers. Even quiet Mr. Peterson from the end of the lake had security footage of Deborah trespassing on his property to photograph violations that existed only in her imagination. She threatened to have our dogs removed by animal control, Maria revealed during one of our evening strategy sessions. Said our golden retrievers were aggressive breeds that violated insurance requirements. Golden retrievers, Marcus. The most dangerous thing they've ever done is drool on someone's shoes. The smell of Maria's homemade enchiladas filled her kitchen as we spread evidence across her dining room table like generals planning a military campaign. Every photo, every recording, every financial document painted the same picture: systematic abuse of power for personal gain. Florence had been keeping the most detailed records of all. Her daily log read like a case study in corruption, documenting how Deborah's inspections always seemed to target the same families while completely ignoring obvious violations by her allies. "She's been doing this for 7 years, Florence said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed her notes. 7 years of destroying families and stealing money, all while pretending to protect property values. The community dynamics had completely shifted. What started as isolated families suffering in silence had become a coordinated resistance movement. Deborah's reign of terror was finally facing organized opposition, and she was running scared. That's when she made her biggest mistake yet: filing a petition to have me forcibly removed from the community for disruptive behavior and mental instability. She actually tried to argue that my legal challenges proved I was unfit for community living. The evening air carried the sound of laughter from our impromptu victory celebration. Deborah had just handed us a defamation lawsuit on a silver platter, complete with documented lies and character assassination attempts. She thought she was delivering the knockout punch. Instead, she'd given us the evidence we needed to destroy her completely. Everything changed on a foggy Thursday morning in October when I drove to the county recorder's office to research HOA formation documents for Patricia's case. I was looking for procedural violations in how Deborah had been amending bylaws. What I found instead made me pull over to the side of the road and stare at the documents in complete shock. The musty smell of old paper and bureaucratic coffee filled the cramped records office as I scrolled through property deeds dating back to 2019. I was cross-referencing the original developer agreements when a familiar name jumped off the page. Blackwood Holdings, LLC. My breath caught in my throat. Blackwood Holdings was the shell corporation my software company had used for real estate investments during Sarah's illness. In the chaos of her final months and my grief afterward, I'd completely forgotten about several automated purchases my financial advisor had made. But there it was in black and white. Blackwood Holdings LLC had purchased the entire 847-acre Willowbrook Valley in March 2019 for $12.8 million. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth as I read the fine print. The original developer, Willowbrook Estates Inc., had only bought development rights, not fee-simple ownership of the underlying land. Every single house in the valley, including Deborah's, existed on 99-year ground leases from the true landowner, me. I owned every blade of grass Deborah was standing on, every tree she'd ordered cut down, every inch of lakefront she thought she controlled. The woman who'd been terrorizing me with fake violations and illegal liens was technically my tenant. The sound of my heart pounding echoed in my ears as the full implications hit me. As ground lessor, I had ultimate authority over all property use in the valley. The HOA existed only by my permission. Every lien, every assessment, every rule change was subject to my approval as the superior property owner. I remembered Sarah encouraging that land investment during one of her lucid moments between chemo treatments. "It's not just about the money," she'd whispered, holding my hand in her hospital bed. "Someday we might be able to protect a place like this for families who really need it." She'd been right, as usual. Even in her final weeks, she'd been thinking about legacy and protecting others. The clerk behind the counter looked concerned as I sat there staring at documents with what must have been a very strange expression. I mumbled something about needing copies and stumbled out to my truck in a daze. This changed everything. I could end Deborah's reign of terror with a single phone call, evict her, dissolve the HOA, restructure the entire community however I wanted. The nuclear option wasn't just available, it was legally bulletproof. But as I sat in my truck, watching the morning fog lift off the lake, I realized something important. Simply revealing my ownership would solve my immediate problem, but might not protect future residents from similar abuse. Deborah would be gone, but the system that allowed her to flourish would remain intact. There was a better way, a way that would expose her corruption, compensate her victims, and create lasting protections for the entire community. Sarah had always believed in justice that healed rather than just punished. The cool October air carried the scent of pine needles and possibility as I made my decision. I wouldn't play my ace card yet. I'd gather enough evidence to destroy Deborah's operation completely, then use my ownership authority to build something better in its place. Patricia nearly dropped her coffee when I called with the news. "Marcus, this is unprecedented. You could literally shut down the entire HOA today." "I know," I said, watching an eagle circle over the lake that I apparently owned. "But I want to do this right. Sarah and I bought this land to create something special. Let's make sure it stays that way." Riley was even more excited about the strategic possibilities. "Dad, as ground lessor, you can restructure the whole governance system, create resident protections that can't be overturned by future boards, build in transparency requirements, term limits, financial oversight, everything needed to prevent another Deborah." The revelation felt like Sarah reaching out from beyond to hand me the tools I needed. Not just for revenge, but for redemption. This valley could become the community she'd envisioned, a place where neighbors looked out for each other instead of tearing each other down. I decided to keep gathering evidence while Deborah dug her own grave deeper. Let her escalate her attacks, commit more crimes, reveal the full extent of her corruption. When the time came for my revelation, it would be devastating and complete. The woman who demolished my house thinking she owned the place was about to learn exactly who held the real power in Willowbrook Valley. The week after my groundbreaking discovery, my house turned into a war room that would make the Pentagon jealous. Riley drove up from Denver with boxes of legal files, Connor brought architectural survey equipment, and Patricia arrived with a forensic accountant who looked like she could audit Al Capone's books and still have energy left for hot yoga. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the ozone scent of multiple laptops running at full capacity as we mapped out our strategy across Sarah's antique dining room table. The one she'd insisted we buy for important family meetings. She would have loved this particular meeting. "Okay, team," Riley announced, spreading financial documents like a general planning D-Day. "We're building multiple cases simultaneously. criminal fraud, civil RICO violations, environmental crimes, and constitutional civil rights violations. By the time we're done, Deborah's going to need more lawyers than a tech startup facing congressional hearings. Our forensic accountant, Janet Morrison, had already uncovered a goldmine of evidence. The HOA books read like a masterclass in creative accounting, if your goal was federal prison time. The scratch of Janet's pen across yellow legal pads became the soundtrack to Deborah's downfall as she traced $127,000 in suspicious community improvements. She wasn't even subtle about it. Janet laughed, the texture of smooth paper rustling between her fingers. Look at this. $8,500 for landscape consulting services paid to Mountain Vista Design Solutions, which is just a DBA for her personal checking account. The woman was literally writing herself checks and calling it community expenses. Connor had spent the weekend conducting what he called architectural reconnaissance throughout the valley. His survey equipment beeped and clicked like a mechanical heartbeat as he documented actual property boundaries versus HOA fiction. The results were fascinating and legally explosive. "Dad, she's been collecting fees for maintaining common areas that don't actually exist," Connor explained, his finger tracing lines across detailed maps. "This community recreation area she charges everyone $200 annually to maintain? It's actually Mrs. Chen's backyard. She's been billing residents to mow someone's private lawn." I remembered something crucial from my software company days when we dealt with embezzlement by a CFO. When building a case against systematic corruption, you need overwhelming evidence from multiple angles. It's not enough to prove someone stole. You have to prove they stole systematically, repeatedly, and with intent to defraud. That turns misdemeanor theft into felony racketeering. The technical preparation was yielding incredible results. Patricia had filed emergency injunctions to stop foreclosure proceedings, while Riley coordinated with federal environmental investigators about illegal tree removals and improper demolition debris disposal. The EPA was very interested in Deborah's tendency to treat environmental regulations like optional suggestions. Our community intelligence network had grown into something that would make the NSA proud. Tom, Maria, and Florence had recruited 12 families willing to testify, creating a database of violations that read like a prosecutor's wet dream. Each family brought recordings, photos, and documentation spanning years of selective enforcement and financial extortion. The mechanical whir of Maria's printer working overtime filled her kitchen as she organized evidence packets. Every photo was dated, cross-referenced with HOA financial records, and organized into a timeline that revealed an undeniable pattern of predatory behavior. "Look at this progression," she said, arranging photos chronologically across her granite counter. Every family who questioned her authority got hit with escalating violations until they either submitted completely or sold at a loss. It's like watching a shark circle wounded prey. Florence had become our unofficial historian, her detailed logs revealing the sophisticated nature of Deborah's operation. The soft rustle of notebook pages turned our strategy sessions into masterclasses in systematic abuse documentation. "She targets newcomers first," Florence explained, reviewing 3 years of meticulous handwritten notes. "Gets them scared and isolated before they can build community connections. Then she moves on to elderly residents who can't afford prolonged legal battles. But we weren't just planning destruction. We were designing resurrection. Using my authority as groundlesser, we mapped out a new governance structure with built-in safeguards against future abuse. Mandatory financial transparency, term limits for board members, resident voting rights on all major decisions, and an independent ombudsman system for dispute resolution. When this is over, I told the team during one of our late-night strategy sessions, the taste of determination sharp on my tongue, no one will ever be able to terrorize this community again. We're not just stopping Deborah, we're Sarah-proofing this place against future tyrants. Connor raised his coffee mug with a grin. To building something Mom would be proud of. The cool mountain air through my open windows carried the scent of approaching autumn and possibility as our plans solidified. Criminal evidence, civil violations, environmental charges, and constitutional claims all lined up like dominoes. When we pushed the first one, Deborah's entire corrupt empire would collapse in spectacular fashion. Media contacts were scheduled. Law enforcement was briefed and standing by. Federal investigators were preparing simultaneous raids. Everything was ready. We just needed Deborah to make her final, fatal mistake. Deborah's desperation reached new heights when she discovered I was building a case against her. Someone, probably Randy Fletcher, the county inspector who'd suddenly developed a conscience, had tipped her off that federal investigators were asking questions about environmental violations and financial irregularities. Her response was swift, vicious, and completely predictable. total warfare. It started with sabotage. On a Tuesday morning, I discovered that my security cameras had been accidentally damaged during routine utility maintenance. The electrical crew claimed they'd been hired by the HOA to upgrade community infrastructure, but their work truck had no company logos and the workers spoke in hushed tones like they were planning a bank heist. The acrid smell of damaged electrical wiring filled my garage as I surveyed the destruction. Every camera cable had been cleanly cut, and my main recording unit had suffered what the crew called unfortunate water damage from a mysteriously burst pipe. But here's where Deborah showed just how panicked she'd become. The mini twist that revealed her complete loss of rational thinking. She'd actually filed a restraining order against me. The legal papers arrived via certified mail, claiming I was stalking and harassing her through aggressive surveillance and intimidation tactics. According to her sworn statement, my security cameras constituted criminal voyeurism, my legal challenges were vexatious litigation, and my very presence in the community created a climate of fear and hostility. She was basically arguing that defending myself against her corruption was a form of domestic terrorism. The metallic taste of outrage filled my mouth as I read her accusations. This woman had demolished my house, stolen community funds, and terrorized dozens of families, and now she was claiming to be the victim. My counterpunch came in multiple forms, all coordinated through Riley's network of legal contacts. While Deborah was busy playing victim, we were quietly implementing what Riley called defensive documentation protocols. Connor had already installed backup security systems that Deborah didn't know about. Hidden cameras with wireless transmission capabilities that couldn't be sabotaged by fake utility crews. Every one of her sabotage attempts was being recorded in real time and uploaded to secure cloud servers. "Dad," Connor explained while installing the final hidden camera, "she just gave us evidence of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Federal investigators love it when targets try to destroy evidence." I'd also learned something valuable from a previous business dispute involving corporate espionage. When someone tries to silence you through legal intimidation, it usually means they're hiding something big enough to destroy them. Deborah's restraining order wasn't just harassment. It was a confession of guilt wrapped in legal paperwork. Riley had filed counter motions documenting Deborah's pattern of abuse and requesting sanctions for frivolous litigation. But more importantly, she'd coordinated with federal environmental investigators to launch a simultaneous investigation into the demolished house debris contaminating the lake. "The EPA doesn't mess around with environmental crimes," Riley explained during our emergency strategy call. "Once they open an investigation, local corruption becomes a federal matter with serious prison time attached." Meanwhile, Deborah's desperation was escalating to criminal levels. My truck tires got slashed in the grocery store parking lot, 4 perfectly clean cuts that spoke of professional vandalism rather than random mischief. Anonymous complaints were filed with the state licensing board about Riley's law practice, claiming she was operating outside her jurisdiction and pursuing frivolous environmental claims. The sound of my phone buzzing with threatening voicemails became a daily reminder of how cornered Deborah had become. But she saved her most vicious attack for last, a social media campaign questioning my mental health. Fake Facebook accounts started posting about a grieving widower who'd lost touch with reality and was taking out his emotional problems on innocent neighbors. The posts included out-of-context photos of me taken during my security camera installations, making normal maintenance work look like paranoid surveillance activities. The bitter taste of defamation mixed with coffee during my morning calls with Patricia, who was documenting every false post for our inevitable lawsuit. "Marcus, she's handed us a textbook defamation case," Patricia said, screenshots printing in the background. "Written lies, published to third parties, causing reputational damage. It's like she's following a how-to guide for getting sued into oblivion." Our community intelligence network was capturing everything. Tom had recorded phone conversations where Deborah admitted to making examples of troublemakers. Maria's hidden cameras had caught the fake utility crew cutting my security cables. Even Florence had audio of Deborah coordinating the social media attacks with her inner circle. The smell of fresh evidence folders filled Patricia's office as we prepared our nuclear response. Every act of sabotage, every false statement, every attempt at intimidation was meticulously documented and cross-referenced with federal law. Connor's hidden cameras had captured Deborah's crew vandalizing my property while she watched from her car, clipboard in hand like she was conducting a symphony of destruction. The footage was so clear you could read her license plate and see her checking items off her list. But the most damning evidence came from audio recordings of Deborah's increasingly frantic phone calls, captured by surveillance equipment she didn't know existed. Her voice had taken on a desperate, almost manic quality as she coordinated attacks and tried to silence witnesses. "We need to speed this up," her voice crackled through the speakers during one of our evidence review sessions. "If the feds start digging into the books, we're all going to prison." The evening mountain air carried the scent of victory as we realized Deborah had just confessed to federal crimes on tape. Her desperation had transformed her from a clever predator into a panicked amateur, making mistakes that would destroy her entire operation. She thought she was cornering me with intimidation and sabotage. Instead, she was providing the final pieces of evidence we needed to demolish her completely. By the morning of our planned confrontation at the annual HOA meeting, Deborah had apparently decided that if she was going down, she'd take me with her in the most spectacular way possible. Her final gambit was breathtaking in its audacity and stupidity: an emergency demolition of my house based on a fabricated structural safety report. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the thunderous roar of diesel engines and the metallic screech of hydraulic equipment. Through my bedroom window, I watched a convoy of demolition trucks rolling down my driveway like an invading army. The smell of exhaust fumes mixed with morning lake mist created this surreal, apocalyptic atmosphere. Deborah stood 50 feet away in her perfectly pressed blazer, clipboard clutched against her chest, wearing the expression of someone who'd just won the lottery. Next to her stood Randy Fletcher, the corrupt county inspector, holding official-looking papers that apparently declared my house an immediate structural hazard requiring emergency demolition. The sound of my heart pounding competed with the rumble of heavy machinery as I threw on clothes and ran outside. "Stop!" I shouted at the demolition crew foreman. "This is my property. You can't just—" "Sorry, sir," the foreman called back, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "We have a county demolition order signed by the building inspector. Says the structure is unsafe and poses immediate danger to the community." That's when I noticed the sheriff's deputies positioned around my property, clearly there to prevent me from interfering with Deborah's grand finale. The mini-twist that showed just how far she'd fallen into criminal behavior. She'd convinced local law enforcement that I was mentally unstable and potentially violent. "Mr. Blackwood," Deputy Martinez approached with his hand resting casually on his service weapon, "we need you to step back and let the professionals handle this safety situation." The metallic taste of helplessness flooded my mouth as I watched the demolition crew position their equipment around the house Sarah and I had planned together. Deborah had timed this perfectly. The morning of the HOA meeting, when everyone would be watching, designed to demonstrate her absolute power and my complete defeat. But what Deborah didn't know was that we'd been prepared for exactly this scenario. Connor was already live streaming the entire demolition from multiple hidden camera angles, uploading everything to social media platforms and news outlets. Riley had federal marshals en route with environmental protection orders. Patricia had news crews scheduled to arrive during peak destruction for maximum media impact. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the lake as the first hydraulic arm punched through my living room wall, the room where Sarah had spent her final months planning our future together. I forced myself to watch, knowing that every moment of this destruction was being recorded as evidence of Deborah's criminal conspiracy. Tom, Maria, and Florence had organized covert witness protection, positioning themselves throughout the community with cameras and recording equipment. What looked like random neighbors out for morning walks were actually our intelligence network documenting everything for federal prosecutors. The bitter smell of sawdust mixed with drywall dust created a choking cloud that drifted across the lake as my house disintegrated beam by beam. Deborah's smile grew wider with each crash of falling timber, her clipboard becoming a conductor's baton orchestrating my apparent destruction. But the beautiful irony was that she was actually conducting her own funeral march. Connor's hidden cameras captured every moment of her obvious enjoyment, creating evidence of malicious intent that would destroy any claim of legitimate safety concerns. The audio pickup was so clear you could hear her humming softly as she watched my dreams turn into rubble. The community was gathering now, some residents drawn by the noise, others arriving as part of our coordinated witness protection plan. I could see horror on their faces as they realized Deborah had escalated from financial abuse to outright property destruction. "My God," I heard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her husband, "if she can do this to Marcus, she can do it to any of us." The sound of approaching sirens carried across the morning air, not more local deputies, but federal vehicles responding to Riley's environmental emergency calls. The EPA doesn't take kindly to improper demolition debris disposal, especially when it contaminated protected waterways. Florence was live streaming the destruction on Facebook, her elderly voice shaking with outrage as she narrated Deborah's crimes for thousands of viewers. This is what happens in America when corrupt officials think they're above the law, Florence announced to her growing audience. Maria had positioned herself to capture Deborah's reactions, documenting every smile, every checked item on that clipboard, every moment of obvious satisfaction. The footage would become Exhibit A in our malicious prosecution lawsuit, the rumble of falling walls mixed with the distant sound of helicopter rotors as news crews began arriving right on schedule. Patricia had timed the media coordination perfectly: peak destruction, maximum visual impact, federal investigators arriving simultaneously. But the most beautiful moment came when I spotted Riley's car cresting the hill, followed by a convoy of federal vehicles with EPA logos blazoned across their sides. Deborah's victory celebration was about to become her arrest warrant. The morning sun broke through the clouds just as the last wall of my house collapsed, sending a shower of golden sawdust across the lake surface. Deborah raised her clipboard in triumph, completely oblivious to the federal agents approaching from behind. She thought she'd destroyed Marcus Blackwood. Instead, she just provided the final evidence needed to destroy herself completely. And in about 30 minutes, she was going to learn exactly who owned every grain of sand she was standing on. The taste of sweet revenge mixed with mountain air as I prepared to attend the most satisfying HOA meeting in history. The community center had never seen anything like this. By 7 p.m., every seat was filled with residents, plus local media crews, county officials, and what looked like half of Denver's legal community. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with fresh coffee created an atmosphere so thick with tension you could cut it with a butter knife. Deborah stood at the podium like a queen addressing her subjects, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile that could have powered the entire valley. Behind her sat her inner circle of enablers, all wearing matching expressions of smug satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with false authority, "today we successfully addressed a serious safety hazard that threatened our entire community. The emergency demolition of the Blackwood property eliminates a structural danger that could have compromised neighborhood values and resident safety." The sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the packed room as she paced behind the podium like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "I hope this action demonstrates our commitment to maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook Valley the premier residential community in Colorado," she continued, checking items off her clipboard with theatrical precision. "Mr. Blackwood's unfortunate inability to accept reasonable community guidelines forced us to take decisive action." She paused for effect, scanning the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won the war. "Before we proceed with tonight's agenda, I'm calling for an immediate vote to permanently ban Mr. Blackwood from all community property for his pattern of disruptive and potentially dangerous behavior." The metallic taste of anticipation flooded my mouth as I stood up slowly from my seat in the back row. Every head in the room turned toward me, cameras swiveling to capture what everyone assumed would be my moment of defeat. "Deborah," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "before we vote on anything, there's something everyone should know about property ownership in this valley." I walked calmly to the front, pulling a manila folder from my jacket. "You see, I've been doing some research into our community's legal structure, and I discovered something fascinating." The sound of rustling papers filled the air as I opened the folder and removed county recorder documents. Connor had prepared a PowerPoint presentation that now appeared on the main screen, showing official property records in clear, undeniable detail. It turns out that every single house in Willowbrook Valley, including yours, Deborah, exists on my property under 99-year ground lease agreements. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the reality hit the crowd. Camera flashes began popping like strobe lights as reporters realized they'd stumbled onto the story of the decade. "That's right," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Through my corporation, Blackwood Holdings LLC, I own every acre of land you're all standing on. The HOA operates only with my permission as ground lessor." Deborah's face had gone from smug satisfaction to pale shock in about 3 seconds. Her clipboard trembled in her hands as she stared at the documentation on the screen. "You demolished my house this morning, Deborah, thinking you'd finally destroyed the troublemaker who dared question your authority. But you destroyed a building on land you don't own, violated multiple federal environmental laws, and committed felonies in front of 47 witnesses and live stream cameras." Riley stepped forward from the crowd, her environmental lawyer credentials giving weight to her next words. "The EPA has already opened criminal investigations into illegal demolition debris disposal, contamination of protected waterways, and violation of the Clean Water Act." Patricia emerged from the audience with a thick folder of legal documents. The state attorney general's office has filed charges for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering based on evidence of systematic financial abuse spanning 7 years. The sound of heavy boots on wooden floors announced the arrival of federal marshals through the main entrance. Deputy U.S. Marshal Jennifer Torres stepped forward with arrest warrants in hand. "Deborah Whitmore," Marshal Torres announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of federal funds, environmental crimes, and violation of civil rights under color of law." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the suddenly silent room as Deborah's reign of terror came to its spectacular end. Her clipboard clattered to the floor, violation notices scattering like leaves in the wind. But I wasn't finished. "As ground lessor and true owner of this valley," I announced to the stunned crowd, "I'm immediately dissolving the current HOA board and implementing new governance structures designed to protect residents from exactly this kind of abuse." The taste of justice mixed with mountain air streaming through open windows as I outlined the changes: mandatory financial transparency, term limits for all board positions, resident voting rights on major decisions, and an independent ombudsman system for dispute resolution. No one will ever again be terrorized in their own home by petty tyrants who think rules don't apply to them, I declared, watching as county investigators began seizing HOA financial records as evidence. Camera crews captured every moment as federal agents led Deborah away in handcuffs, her perfect blazer wrinkled and her authority reduced to nothing. The woman who'd spent 7 years destroying families had been destroyed herself in less than 7 minutes. Florence Pike stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for giving us our community back." The applause started slowly, then built into a thunderous ovation that shook the rafters. Outside, I could hear the sound of news helicopters circling overhead, broadcasting Deborah's downfall to the entire state. The most satisfying HOA meeting in history had just come to its perfect conclusion. 6 months later, Willowbrook Valley had transformed into the community Sarah and I had always dreamed it could be. Deborah Whitmore was serving a 3-year federal sentence in minimum security prison, with an additional $200,000 restitution order that would follow her for the rest of her life. Her brother's contracting company had filed for bankruptcy after losing all their licenses, and Randy Fletcher was working as a night shift security guard after being stripped of his inspector credentials. The criminal case had made national news, becoming a cautionary tale about HOA abuse that legal scholars were already citing in academic papers. Patricia told me she'd received calls from attorneys in 12 states dealing with similar corruption cases. But the real victory wasn't Deborah's downfall. It was what we'd built in its place. The new Willowbrook Valley Community Trust operated with transparency that would make Switzerland jealous. Every financial decision required resident approval. Board members served 2-year terms with mandatory rotation, and our independent ombudsman system had already resolved 8 disputes without a single lawsuit. Property values had increased 15% once word spread about our resident-friendly governance structure. Turns out people were willing to pay premium prices for communities where neighbors actually looked out for each other instead of trying to destroy each other. The smell of fresh lumber filled the morning air as Connor supervised construction of my new house, an eco-friendly design that incorporated solar panels, geothermal heating, and a rainwater collection system that would have made Sarah proud. We'd built it on the exact same spot where Deborah had demolished the original, as a monument to the fact that justice sometimes comes with a nice view. But the changes went far beyond just governance and construction. Tom Chen's elderly parents had moved back to the valley after we restructured their previous sale to recover the $200,000 they'd lost to Deborah's extortion. Maria Santos now served as our community ombudsman, using her experience with selective enforcement to protect future residents. Florence Pike had replanted her husband's memorial rose garden, with the new HOA paying for professional landscaping as an apology for years of abuse. The environmental restoration had exceeded even Riley's expectations. The lake cleanup, funded entirely by recovered embezzlement money, had removed all contamination from the illegal demolition debris. EPA monitoring showed water quality had returned to pristine levels, and we'd actually received a state environmental stewardship award. Riley's environmental law practice had gained national recognition from the case, and she'd established a pro bono clinic specializing in HOA abuse victims. "Dad," she told me during one of our weekly calls, "we're getting referrals from communities across the country. Apparently Deborah wasn't unique, she was just uniquely stupid about getting caught." The Sarah Blackwood Memorial Scholarship had already funded 3 environmental law students at the University of Colorado. with plans to expand the program as our community trust grew. Every year, we'd select students who demonstrated passion for protecting communities from exactly the kind of abuse Deborah had perfected. Our annual Healthy Communities Festival had become the social event of the Colorado Mountains, featuring local businesses, environmental education, and workshops on resident rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the Valley's biggest celebration focused on community cooperation, everything Deborah had spent 7 years trying to destroy. But my favorite change was the most personal one. Every morning I walked the wooden dock that had started this entire war, watching eagles circle overhead and listening to the sound of children playing in yards where their families no longer lived in fear. The taste of mountain air mixed with the scent of pine needles reminded me daily that Sarah's vision for this place had finally come true. The conservation fund we'd established had protected an additional 500 acres of surrounding wilderness, ensuring that future generations would enjoy the same pristine mountain environment that had drawn us here originally. Sometimes I'd catch myself having conversations with Sarah's memory, telling her about the families who now felt safe in their own homes. The legal precedent from our case had already been cited in 23 other HOA corruption prosecutions across the country. Colorado had passed new legislation limiting HOA authority and requiring financial transparency, with similar bills pending in 6 other states. During our community's second annual meeting under the new governance structure, Florence Pike stood up to make an announcement that brought tears to my eyes. "I want to thank Marcus Blackwood for showing us that good people who organize are always stronger than bad people who cheat," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This valley is proof that communities can heal from even the worst abuse when neighbors stand together." The applause that followed felt like Sarah's approval echoing off the mountains. As I write this, sitting on the deck of our rebuilt house with my morning coffee, I can see Tom and Maria's kids playing by the lake while their parents chat with new neighbors who moved here specifically because of our reputation for fair governance. The sound of laughter carries across water that sparkles in the morning sun, untainted by corruption or fear. Deborah thought she could terrorize people into submission through petty tyranny and selective enforcement. Instead, she taught an entire community that standing together against bullies creates something stronger and more beautiful than anything individual wealth can buy. And every time I watch an eagle soar over this valley that Sarah loved, I know she'd be proud of what we built from the ashes of Deborah's empire. Now, I want to hear your stories. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA nightmare. Let's help each other spot the warning signs and fight back against petty tyrants who think they're above the law. And hit that subscribe button for more stories of underdogs outsmarting corrupt systems, because justice is always sweeter when it's shared. Speaking of property rights and corrupt officials, wait until you hear about the city councilman who tried to seize my neighbor's farm through eminent domain. He had no idea she was a retired federal judge with a very long memory and an even longer reach.
That's a wrap for today's episode on HOA Stories. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and let us know if you've dealt with HOA madness too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA meltdown we post.